All right, so today we are talking about estimating square roots. So that's going to be our title for today. Estimating square roots. All right, we are going to have an essential question. So that goes right up at the top. All right, our essential question for today is how do I estimate a non-perfect square root to the 10th place. So yesterday we talked about squares and square roots, and we mostly focused on perfect squares, but sometimes we're not always going to have perfect squares. We're going to have what's called non-perfect squares, and we're going to have to be able to figure out how to estimate those, but still using the idea of perfect squares. So we're going to figure out where our non-perfect square falls in place, like on a number line, around our perfect squares that we already know. So I do have a printout of our perfect squares, so we're going to be using this today. So we are going to get started with some steps to follow to estimate a square root, a non-perfect square root. So step 1, first thing you're going to do is you are going to decide if the number under the square root is a perfect square. Decide if the number under the square root is a perfect square, okay? So if it is a perfect square, easy. That's what we did yesterday. If it's a perfect square root of, say, square root of 36, we already talked about, okay, we know that's a perfect square. We know the square root of 36 is 6. So if it is not a perfect square, though, then we're going to move on and we're going to go on to step 2 to estimate what that number would be if it's not perfect. So step 2, is find which two perfect squares that number is in between. And we're going to do all of this. We're going to follow all the steps in just a minute with some examples, and that'll make more sense to us. But if the number is not a perfect square, then you're going to figure out which two perfect squares it falls between. And that's going to help us figure out how we're going to estimate that square root. So number 3, next thing we're going to do is we are going to take the square root of those perfect squares that are around that number. And then number 4, we're going to estimate the final answer. So again, this will make more sense to us once we start doing it in some examples. Okay, but those are the steps we're going to follow. Okay? So here we go. Let's get started with some examples. All right, so number 1, let's say I want you to estimate the square root of 8. Estimate the square root of 8. All right, so we're going to follow our steps to figure out what that number would be, okay? So step 1, decide if the number under the square root is a perfect square. So let's pull up our perfect squares again. So remember, in this column, these are the perfect squares. These are the perfect squares. So if we have a square root of 8, do you see 8 anywhere in here? Is that a perfect square? Nope. So now we move on to step 2. It is not a perfect square, so we go to step 2. Find which two perfect squares that number is in between. So looking at 8, we want to see which numbers it's in between, which perfect squares it's in between. So 8 is in between 4 and 9. Those are the two perfect squares that 8 is in between. So we are going to write it out like this. In between square root of 4 and square root of 9. Those are the perfect squares that 8 falls in between. Okay? Number 3, take the square root of these perfect squares. Okay? So, here's our list again. If 4 is a perfect square, we talked about square root of 4. Figure out what number times itself gives us 4. Well, if we take the square root, we know 2 is the square root of 4, because 2 times 2 times itself is 4. So the square root of 4 is 2, and the square root of 9 is 3. So that means if you think about on a number line, these are numbers on the number line. 2 and 3 are numbers on a number line. So if we have 1, 2, 3, and 4, here's your numbers on the number line. Okay, here is square root of 4 at 2. Here is square root of 9 at 3. This square root of 8 falls, let me grab a different color. This square root of 8 falls in between square root of 4 and square root of 9, right probably about here, because it's closer to square root of 9 than square root of 4. 8 is closer to 9 than it is to 4. So square root of 8 would fall probably about here. So that's essentially what you need to be thinking about. Where does that square root fall on a number line? Once you find the square root of the perfect squares, the square root of 4, square root of 9, and figure out those numbers on the number line, you can easily, hopefully, see where that square root's going to fall. So square root of 8 falls about there. So our goal is we want to estimate a non-perfect square to the 10th place. So if I was going to estimate where that falls in between 2 and 3, I would say probably 2.8 or 2.9, I think. So square root of 8 is, we're going to do the squiggly lines, approximately, and again, there's not a completely perfect answer I'm looking for here, but if you gave me, I would probably accept 2.7, 2.8, or 2.9, because that's about how close it is in between 2 and 3. It's closer to 3, so I would accept any of these answers for square root of 8. Okay, so hopefully we're getting the gist of estimating square roots. Let's do another example. Okay, if I asked you which two integers is square root of 74 in between? If that was my question, which two integers is square root of 74 in between? Okay, again, you can pull out your perfect squares. You can always keep that with you so that you can easily look at those and figure out where that non-perfect square falls. So square root of 74 is probably in here. So in between 64 and 81, in between those two perfect squares. So we're going to say it is in between. Now, this is asking for which two integers. So our end answer should be an integer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Those are all integers. So we're first looking at the perfect squares, and then we're figuring out which two integers it's in between. So it's in between square root of 64 and square root of 81. But when I go ahead and find the square root of those perfect squares, square root of 64 is 8. Square root of 81 is 9. So when this question says which two integers is square root of 74 in between, I'm looking for integers here. It's in between integers 8 and 9, because that's kind of where it would fall on a number line. Okay? We're going to do one more. So I'm going to give you one problem that would be like a multiple choice problem. So if this was the problem I gave you, which number is closest to square root of 28? I'm going to give you some examples. A, B, C, and D. So pretend it's a multiple choice question. So we're going to say A is 5.2, B is 5.7, C is 6.5, and D is 5.8. All right, so we want to know which number is closest to square root of 28. So again, let's follow our steps, okay? So it is in between perfect squares 25 and 36. So it is in between square root of 25 and square root of 36. Okay? If I find those square roots of the perfect squares, square root of 25 is 5, square root of 36 is 6. So again, you can kind of think about it on a number line. So here would be like 4, 5, 6, 7. So we are looking at square root of 28. So we've got right here, square root of 25 is 5, square root of 36 is 6. So square root of 28 is going to fall probably right about here. It is closer to square root of 25. I'm going to write it right here, 28. It's closer to square root of 25. 25 and 28 are only 3 spaces away, but 28 and 36 are 8 spaces away, 8 numbers away. So it is going to be closer to square root of 25 or closer to 5 than it is to 6. So it should fall probably about here. So looking at your answer choices, which number is closest to square root of 28? Well, we said it should be closer to 5 than 6 because those are only 3 numbers away, whereas these two are 8 numbers away. It should be closest to 5, and the number that is closest to 5 is 5.2. So that is our answer.